Custom menu A1. So we have autofocus mode. Here's where you select what kind of focusing you want. This can also be selected from the super control panel. Now, the one thing that's new in here is preset manual focus. And we'll go over where to set that in a little later in this menu. Auto exposure lock, autofocus lock. This is where you set how you focus with which button. So in single autofocus, continuous, and manual focus, you can select if you want in mode 1 that the focus will work using the shutter button. Mode 3, you fire using the AEL button or whatever button you've customized AEL to be. And then some variations of that. I have mine set to mode 3. Autofocus scanner. This is basically focus hunting. So if you've ever tried to focus in the dark and the camera has racked focus from close to far at trying to lock on a subject, this is where you control this behavior. In mode 1, the camera will not hunt anymore. It just won't, if it can't focus, it just won't even try. Mode 2, it'll hunt once, and in mode 3, it'll keep trying to hunt. Continuous autofocus lock. This is where you adjust how tight your focusing holds onto its subject. So if an object passes in front of your subject, for instance, will the focus move to that new subject, or will it stick to where its original focus point was? And you can experiment to see what works best with the subjects that you're shooting. Autofocus limiter. This, when it's turned on, you have some options. First, your distance settings. You have 3 options to set your near distance and your far distance. I'm not using these at the moment, but you can set the camera to, say, focus only between 5 feet and 15 feet. So when you try to focus, it will only search between those distances to achieve focus. If you're shooting very specific subjects, this will be quite helpful. And you can set 3 different versions of that. And then priority release in this menu is basically if you can fire the shutter, if it's achieved focus or not. I usually leave mine to fire even if not in focus. I'd rather make a shot than not have the camera let me take a shot, even if the focus isn't right on there. But you can always turn that off. Your focus point settings. This allows you to turn on which modes you like. This is all the focus points, cross type, and a 9 square block. I leave them all on. You never know when you have a subject that will need something different than just a single point. If you turn these off, you won't even have that option to select from. Autofocus area pointer. When it's off, you'll see your focus point in your viewfinder or the back screen, but when you achieve focus, it won't highlight, it won't turn green. In mode 1, it will turn green, and then it'll turn back off. And in mode 2, as long as you're half pressed, the little green box that you've achieved focus will stay on continuously until you've let go or made your shot. Custom menu A2. Autofocus targeting pad. I leave this off, but what it does when it's turned on is if you're looking through the viewfinder and the rear screen is dark, you can actually move your finger over the rear screen to move your focus point. It's kind of interesting, takes a little getting used to. I prefer not to use this at all. I'd rather just adjust my focus point with the back directional pad. But try it out. It's an interesting option that they've added. I leave mine off. Your set home for focus points. This is where you can set a kind of a home position that you can program to a custom button. So no matter where you've adjusted your focus point to, your focus style, you can hit a button and get right back to what your favorite is or your default setting. And now you can have it select a specific autofocus mode to jump back into, a focus point style, as well as where that focus point is. And mine is always just a single point right in the center. Focus point custom settings. Here you have 2 settings you can choose from, and you can go through and modify what the different controls do to your focus points. So the directional pad up and down, for instance, can be moving the focus point around, or it can be changing facial recognition, or changing focus point style. And you can go through and adjust what all the different dials and buttons do in corresponds with your focal point adjustment. So, and you have two different versions of this, and you can really fine tune and set things up the way you want. For me, I find it overkill. I think the default was just fine. Autofocus illuminator. If you're in a dark situation and the camera's struggling to achieve focus, this is the light that comes on as a focus assist. Face priority. This can also be adjusted from Super Control Panel. Here you can pick the different modes of facial detection. Autofocus adjust. This is just like most DSLRs that have fine focus adjustment for lenses. This only works on the phase focusing. So you can, if you have a tool to measure how much front or back focus you have, you can program that in. You can create custom focus point data. You can go into these, you can select them and adjust front or back focus. I'm just using contrast lenses, so I'm going to keep this turned off. Custom menu A3. Preset manual focus distance. This is where you set the actual distance for that autofocus style. And here you can choose where your preset distance is. So I have mine, you can see, is set to 17 feet. I use that number as kind of a hyperfocal distance that I use on a 12mm lens, but you can set yours wherever you'd like. You can set it to 15 feet, you can set it to 50 feet, to infinity. And you just go through and you can change. And you can change to meters as well. And so when you select that focus mode, your camera's lens will automatically move to that focus distance. Manual focus assist. When either of these are turned on, you'll get this functionality. So when you manually focus, magnify will magnify part of the image, and peaking turns focus peaking on. Manual focus clutch, operative or inoperative. This is when you have a lens with the clutch focusing where you can slide back into manual focus and see a distance scale. I know sometimes people will move it back by accident and wonder why their autofocus isn't working. If you don't want the ring to do anything when you pull it back, you can set this to inoperative, and then that feature will be completely disabled no matter what position that ring is in. If you leave it operative, then you will go into that clutch manual focus when you slide the ring back on your lens. Focus ring direction, just which way manual focus works in terms of getting near focus or far focus. Bulb time focusing, this allows you to designate whether manual focus will work if you're in bulb or time mode. And reset lens basically changes the lens focused position when you turn the camera off and then turn the camera back on to its default state. Custom menu B, button function. This is where you can set all your custom buttons and what they do. So function 1 button, function 2, the record button, the AEL button, the viewfinder switch function. These are your front body buttons, your dial pad or directional pad. Then you have B function 1 and 2, as well as the directional pad functions on the grip and the lens function. So you can go through and set those buttons however you like to different functions. You can activate, this is how you set the rear button focus. So you put AEL to whatever button you like, and then as we saw earlier in menu A, to set focus to AEL. Now wherever you set the AEL button, that'll be your focus button. Start stop movie recording, depth of field preview, one touch white balance, autofocus area select, your autofocus point home, so that switches back to your default, setting to RAW plus JPEG, a test picture. This allows a picture to be made, but it doesn't save it, just shows it to you on the back of the screen. Nowadays with large memory cards, it doesn't really make sense why we would want this. Easy enough to take a test picture and then discard it or just leave and delete later, but This lets you just take a shot and see it. Now this is for underwater shooting if you're using housing and you have an electronic lens. Exposure compensation. Digital teleconverter. This switches between normal view and a 2x view. This only works on the JPEG. Brings up keystone compensation. Turns on and off. Magnify. Opens up the magnification screen. Turn HDR on or off. Turn bracketing on or off on whatever mode you were on last. Get into adjust ISO and white balance, or a reversal on which dial they were on. Multifunction, if you're using JPEG, you can adjust a few different items such as selective color, shadow, highlight, and such. Turn peaking on or off. Show the level. With your view selection, you can switch between live view and the super control panel. Again, depending where your eye is against the EVF. Turn the simulated optical viewfinder on or off. You can turn the autofocus limiter on or off. This also lets you select from the different presets by pressing the down arrow pad and then adjusting the dial to select between them. So you can actually hit this button and scroll between 3 preset autofocus distances. Could be useful in certain situations. Preset manual focus jumps right to that preset distance you've set. Lens info settings. When you have a button set to this and you press it, it jumps you automatically to the menu item where you can create a custom lens profile for a manual lens. You can add in EXIF data for the lens if it doesn't have electronic contacts. So if you're using adapted lens, a vintage lens for instance. Image stabilization on or off, and turn the button off completely so it's disabled. Okay, the battery holder. Lock. This lets you turn off the directional pad on the battery grip on or off. Dial function. In here you can select what the dials do in each of these different modes. So let's just go into manual mode, and you can see I have my rear dial set to the aperture, front dial set to shutter, and then when the lever is in mode 2, those dials adjust my white balance and my ISO. And you can adjust these to a bunch of different settings or just turn them off. Dial direction. This is where you can adjust which way the dial turns to go up or down in aperture. You can set that to your preferences. Function lever settings. Now, this, I have mine set to mode 2, and this changes which autofocus mode I'm using. Mode 1 changes the dial function, or you can just turn it off. Mode 3 allows you to switch right into movie mode in position 2, or be in your normal mode dial settings in position 1. And then switch function if you're using an E-M1mkII. This allows your switch button on the left to change when you hit the function lever. This allows you to change from your HDR mode or your autofocus mode to bracketing and flash and compensation. Function lever, power lever. This is something new with the E-M1mkII, and when you hit the function lever, you can either use it as what it's designed to do generally and change your modes, or you can set it to be a power switch. So in position 1, power is on the camera and power is off when it's in position 2. And then the power button just does nothing. You can also switch that around so it's in the opposite of where position 1 power is off and position 2 power is on. I got used to the E-M1mkI where I'm turning power on and off from the left. I stick with that since it works for me. Electronic zoom speed. If you're using a zoom lens that has powered zoom, you can adjust how quickly zoom is in or out with this. Custom menu C1, release priority for single and continuous shooting modes. This allows you, if it's set to on, to fire the shutter even if you're not in focus. And those are your two options, on or off. And then continuous shooting low settings. This is for your standard and anti-shock mode, and this is for your silent mode or electronic shutter. You can adjust what's your max frame per second up to 10. I keep mine set low. And then how many frames can you fire off in a series? Same thing with this one. And then you can also adjust your Pro Capture settings here for each mode. Your maximum frames per second, how many frames are captured when you hit the shutter, how many frames prior to you hitting that shutter are retained, and then how many frames can you shoot off maximum in a burst. Then you can adjust this for your high setting as well. This one is 60 frames per second. You can adjust up to 99 frames in a capture. I have mine set kind of low. I don't use this often, and I don't want a giant burst to eat up a card very quickly, so I keep these pretty low. Custom menu C2. You can adjust image stabilizer modes from here. This can also be adjusted from the Super Control panel. Image stabilization. Priority. This gives you priority to the image stabilization when you have high shooting speeds, or your shooting speeds at a high frame per second gets priority. If you're shooting at a high speed, 15 frames per second at 1,000th of a second, image stabilization is not necessarily required. It helps because it keeps your viewfinder stable, but with this, the camera will give priority to firing off the shots if the stabilization is going to interfere with that speed. Halfway release with image stabilization. This allows the image stabilization to be on from a half press, and if it's set to off, image stabilization will begin with firing of the shutter. Lens IS priority. If you're using a lens that has image stabilization, this will give, when this is turned on, it'll give the lens stabilization priority over the in-body. Custom menu D1. So camera control settings. In here you can select what goes on in the various modes when you hit the info button. So if you were to hit the info button in the art mode, for instance, you would see the art menu, so you can select what art filter you want. And if these were checked, you would also go into live control or live super control panel with each time you press the info button. The same applies with each of these modes. Playback info settings. Same here. You go through and pick what happens when you hit the info button, what information is displayed. When you magnify, again, what happens with that info button being hit. Same with live view. And in live view, you can customize two different settings to go through for what information you want with each press. So I have one that has everything, one that has just the highlight and shadow, for instance, or just the image only. And then playback, with the grid view, you can control which, how many different variations it can show you of thumbnails. Picture mode settings. This is where you can turn on or off picture modes that you're able to select. So as you turn these off, they won't be selectable in the relevant modes. Same with shutter modes. Here you can go through and turn on or off different modes. So if you don't want to use a Pro Capture or any kind of high-speed shooting, you can turn these off. You can see I've turned off the standard modes. I always use an anti-shock mode or occasionally the silent modes, and the ones I don't use, I just turn them off so I don't even have to scroll through them. Same with multifunction settings. If you're shooting JPEG and you hit the multifunction key, you can control what options come up during that. Custom menu D2. Live View Boost. You can select when Live View Boost in mode 1 or 2 is on. In manual shooting, you can turn it on to mode 1 or to mode 2. Mode 2 is for really dark settings. Like if you're trying to focus on a star, this will really pump up the gain, but there's a delay of about a second or so with as you do things. So if you turn the focus, it'll jump while exposures are made showing you that really high gained image. So I'll turn that off on that mode. Same, you can adjust for bulb and time mode, live composite, and then any other mode that would utilize that. Your art live view mode. This affects how much of the art filter you see on your live display. When you have it full on, it can slow down your frame rate, or your refresh rate of the LCD, I mean. You can also have it as a lighter overlay on your screen, so you have a faster refresh rate. High frame rate for your display. You can do normal or high. I prefer high. This gives you a lot less lag when you're looking around in the EVF, for instance, and makes the view seem a lot more normal. Live view close-up settings. So when you magnify, this will adjust what happens when you hit the shutter button. If you were to autofocus in mode 2, while you're magnified, you can actually focus and work as if that's your normal view. If you're in mode 1, the enlargement will end and you'll go back to your standard view. And live view boost on magnification. So if you magnify in, live view boost can automatically turn on to normalize the view that you're looking at, though that doesn't affect exposure. It's just for viewing. Depth of field preview settings. You can turn depth of field lock on or off. And again, you can have a live view boost on depth of field. Often, coming from other cameras, when you hit your depth of field preview button, the view goes really dark, especially if you're stopped way down. So when you hit the depth of field preview button, if you've customized it to a function button, when that view goes way dark due to being stopped down, the camera can automatically turn on live view boost, and that will enhance your view so you can actually see your depth of field preview in a normal looking exposure. Very handy. Flicker reduction. This is if you're shooting under artificial lights, for instance. This can automatically handle the flickering on your display. Custom menu D3. You have options for your grid settings. If you have your grid on, you can set presets for the color of your grid and how bright it is. You can see this one was white or gray, and this one is a red grid. You can pick what grid you have displayed, and you can duplicate these grid settings to the EVF if this is on. Focus peaking settings. You can adjust your peaking color. You can adjust how intense it is. And you can have it adjust your image brightness if you want to help kind of enhance the viewing, the peaking against certain subjects. That won't change your exposure. It's only changing what you see. Histogram settings, you can adjust when the highlight and shadow clipping turns on. 0 is full shadow and 255 is pure white highlight. If you adjust these down, your highlight warnings will come on sooner than pure white. I recommend you test out your highlight and shadow recovery with 255 and 0 and see if you want to be notified sooner than that or not. I just leave them here. Mode guide tells you about the mode when you turn the mode dial, tells you what mode you're in. I have this turned off by default. If you turn on, it'll just give you some information as you turn that mode dial. Alright, selfie assist mode. If this is on, when you have your screen flipped out and turned towards you as if you're taking a selfie with the camera, it will create a mirror image in your screen of what you see. If you have this off, the camera will just show you exactly what the camera normally sees. So this helps if you're trying to turn the camera and perfectly frame yourself with one hand. Custom menu D4. This turns the camera sounds on or off. The autofocus sounds. HDMI control. This lets you control the HDMI signal going out of the camera when you're viewing playback on a television. So the output size, HDMI control if you have a remote that will control playback, and then output frame rates. And USB mode selects what kind of mode the camera goes into when you connect it with a USB cable. If you have it set to auto, the camera will ask you on the back of the screen each time what mode you want to be in, and you have to select. Otherwise, you can leave it on the mode you use most often. I set it to auto, as I use different modes mostly. Custom menu E1, exposure shift. This lets you fine-tune your metering modes compensation. So if you're shooting for some reason with a light meter that reads higher or lower, or you want to match up to a film that you're using, or for whatever reason that you would want your meter to read more or less than standard, you can adjust these here. There you have your central and your spot. Your exposure steps, 1/3, a half step, and a whole step movement. Same with ISO, third or a whole. Your auto ISO, you can set the upper limit for ISO and your default. Your lowest shutter speed setting, this you can set to auto and the camera will select 1 over the lens value usually, once it gets down to that low point, or you can set it to whatever you'd like it to be fixed at. And you have options of shutter speeds. Auto ISO, you can choose what modes you can use this in. Noise filter, this is for your JPEGs if you want to apply noise reduction. And noise reduction, this noise reduction is for long exposure noise reduction. So any shots longer than a second, if you want to apply a dark frame reduction to it, you can set it to do it automatically as it needs it, as the camera thinks it needs it. You can force it to do it to everything over a second, or you can have it off. Custom menu E2, bulb timer, how far you can push with them. I leave mine at 30 minutes. Bulb timer monitor, this reduces the brightness by an amount. And if you're doing long exposures, this really helps to save your battery a bit. Live bulb, this is how often it does a refresh on the screen. You can adjust this based on what you're shooting. Same with live time, how often the screen will refresh to give you an update. And then your live composite settings. You can adjust what your starting exposure is. Custom menu E3, you can set your metering, which can also be done from the Super Control panel. Your metering for exposure lock, if you want it different. And your spot metering. You have some different options that you can select from. A spot on the highlights or a spot on the shadows. You can have these on or off. Custom menu F, flash sync speed. The highest you can select is 1/250th, but you can also slow it down. I prefer a fast flash sync speed. Flash your slowest sync limit. I have mine set to 30 seconds. Again, you can change the timing on that. Flash compensation and exposure compensation. If this is set to on, your exposure compensation will be applied as your flash compensation. I leave that off so I can adjust them separately. And then your flash white balance. When a flash is on, setting this to off will do nothing. Setting it to white balance auto will automatically move you to an auto white balance or a white balance flash when a flash is connected. If you leave this to off, you can select your own white balance at that point. Custom menu G. So the image quality set, this is for your JPEGs. You can have 4 different settings. You can adjust 4 different ways and combinations of what you'd like. So a large superfine JPEG, a medium fine, a medium normal or basic or superfine, or small. Pixel count adjusts how large the middle JPEG and the small JPEG size are. You can change these. Shading compensation. This is like a vignette removal. So the camera will recognize what lens you're using and automatically adjust for vignetting. I haven't found a real quality change when using this, so I just leave it on. And to me, I've been very satisfied with the results. White balance. This is where you can fine-tune your white balance settings and how much color variation is in them. So you can adjust for green and magenta or red and blue by setting these. And you can adjust this for all your different white balance combinations. Or you can do them all at once by going to all white balance and doing it in that way. Keep warm color for auto white balance. I leave this off. If you're shooting JPEG especially and your images are coming out overly warm or yellow, it might be because you have this option set to on. I always keep this off. Color space, Adobe RGB or sRGB. I leave Adobe RGB for colors. Custom menu H1, card slot settings. This is where we can select what memory card on the E-M1mkII that data is stored to. So we'll come back to save settings in a moment. Save slot for photos, you can select slot 1 or 2. Save slot for your movies, slot 1 or 2. And again, remember, only slot 1 supports the highest data transmissions. And then assign a save folder. You can change the folder name. Create folders. I just leave that all default. Now, save settings. This is where you can go and set redundancy, or what happens when a card becomes full. If it's an auto switch to the next card, or you can have it saved to both cards. So you can go through and have some different settings. Now, when you do, you can select playback slot. Which card are you seeing your playback from? File name. File name controls how naming is kept between different cards. So in auto, it'll continue using the name from the last memory card used. And this is the sequential number for the file names. Edit file name allows you to control, for both sRGB and Adobe RGB, the prefix. You can adjust if you want different letters or numbers to create a prefix for the images. DPI settings, this is where you can adjust what your default DPI is for the images. Copyright settings, if you turn this on, it'll automatically fill in your metadata for copyright. You can enter your name and some copyright info. And lens info. This is interesting. If you're using old manual lenses, you can create information about those lenses, a lens name, focal length, and aperture, and save those. So then you have metadata on the lens you were using for a lens that doesn't have electronic contacts, so it normally wouldn't write that information in. Very helpful if you use a lot of manual lenses or lenses with adapters. Custom menu H2, quick erase, on or off. Anything that deals with erasing and quickly just doesn't sound right to me. I leave it off. If this is on and you go delete a file, it'll just immediately delete it. It won't give you the dialog. RAW plus JPEG erase. This you can control when you delete a file that's got both, what gets deleted. If it's RAW plus JPEG, it's both. If it's RAW only, the JPEG will retain. And priority set, when you go to a menu, this will pre-select a confirmation or not. Custom menu I. EVF auto switch. This is the button that's next to the viewfinder that allows you to switch between the viewfinder and the back screen as you move your eye. It controls the eye sensor. I leave this off. I prefer to hit the button myself. EVF adjust. This is where you can adjust brightness and temperature. If you have auto luminance on, this will automatically adjust the screen's brightness. These I can't show you as it'll jump to the EVF for adjustment, but it's basically, again, temperature and brightness adjustment. EVF style. This allows you to change how your EVF looks. Your EVF info settings. Again, you can customize when you hit the info button what's displayed. So you can have several different views just by hitting that info button. EVF grid settings. Same as the rear grid settings, but you can select different ones for your EVF. Halfway level. So if this is turned on, when you half press the shutter button, a level gauge will appear next to your exposure meter. And that can be helpful if you're trying to shoot level, but you don't want to see, you don't want to go to the back of the screen and get the full level. It's just like a quick view. And then simulated OVF. This is kind of like live view boost, except it neutralizes the color, tries to replicate what you would have seen if you were looking through an optical viewfinder. Custom menu J1, pixel mapping. This is a function that you can go into and hit start, and the camera will fire off an image and try to assess if there's any stuck or hot pixels, and map them and remove them as you make images. Press and hold time. This is a new feature in the E-M1mkII, where you can go through and select how long you have to press and hold something to clear that menu. So, end live view magnification. You can adjust how quickly this happens. So, I'm not too sure why somebody would select anything but the quickest. Now, by going through these and seeing what reset options you have, you can also pick up some interesting tips about quickly clearing settings. So if we were to go into reset keystoning, for instance, when you're in keystone compensation, if you press and hold the OK button, it'll automatically clear those settings back to default. Same thing with for bracketing. If you were to press and hold the bracketing, it'll pull up the bracketing settings. So go through these and you can see some interesting ways you can get around in the camera. Level adjust. If you need to adjust the in-camera level, this is where you would do that from. Touchscreen settings. I have my touchscreen set to off. If you have it on, the touchscreen will be enabled, and then you can use different touchscreen functions. Menu recall. When you hit the menu button, recall, being set to recall, will go to the last menu item you were on. If you have it set to reset, the menu will restart from the very top every time you hit the menu button. Custom menu J2. Battery settings. This allows you to select which batteries you use first, from the grip or from the body battery. The grip is the easier one to change when you have it installed. I would probably select that. Battery status lets you see condition of the current battery how much it's degraded in terms of recharge, how many shots you've made on the battery as well. Backlit LCD. This adjusts how quickly the LCD dims. Sleep is how quickly your camera goes to sleep. You can adjust timing or set it to never go to sleep. Auto power off is how quickly the camera shuts itself down. I have mine set to 5 minutes. Again, you can turn this function off or set it to a really long time. Quick sleep mode. When this is on, you can adjust how quickly the backlit LCD or the sleep mode take function. If you're using an iFi card, this next grayed out option can be adjusted. I don't have any iFi cards in at the moment, so those aren't viewable. And then certification. This just shows you camera certification.